Come, Spirit of God, and in this concluding meditation, calm our thoughts and our minds, make us receptive to your inspirations, your lights, and inspire us with holy desires to may accomplish your will and be beings of praise and glory to God the Father Almighty, who has called us to his service, the salvation of souls in his name. In that context of being called to the service of the All-Holy, we hear the Trisagion coming through the centuries, coming from the call of Isaiah already and being made present forevermore in the liturgy it boasts of East and West. Hagios, 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 Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Here we are in the 6th chapter. He sees the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. His train filled the sanctuary. Above him stood seraphs. Seraph is to burn, isn't it? The burning ones, each one with 6 wings, 2 to cover its face. The modesty of the angels. They are in prostrate mode while we are standing and folding our arms. Each with 6 wings, 2 to cover its face, 2 to cover its feet, and 2 for flying. And they were shouting these words to each other, Holy, holy, holy. Now we have this, of course, it comes through as Lord God of hosts, Adonai, and Sabaoth, Sabaoth is this kind of armies, hosts. It's difficult to translate exactly, but it would seem to mean the heavenly hosts, therefore angelic powers. His glory fills the whole earth, and we are his glory. Homo vivens gloria Dei, says Irenaeus. So we are beings of glory. Laudem gloriae, strangely in the accusative, Blessed Elizabeth of the Trinity. She blessed, that's right, Elizabeth of the Trinity, Carmelite, put it, she was aware of her vocation to be a being of praise and also a tabernacle of the Most High. She was inhabited. Beth Eli, she was aware of her name, and we need to be the same. Now, I want to conclude with a few thoughts on the true thrust of renewal given to our time by what the Spirit was trying to say to the churches in the Second Vatican Council. They are still of generation, essentially, who are applying it. We may not seem so, but in terms of history, we are. And already we have seen...
What was the word that you used?
Which one now? Where are we?
The last. The other generation.
Of those who are applying it. The appliers, because there are 2 separate issues, as I'm going to pull out now, the actual what the Spirit was trying to say to the churches and those who applied it, badly or well, and that is our business, because at grassroots level we are the appliers of the oomph that was coming in that explosion, and it could go either way, but good application is precisely to work hand in hand with the Spirit who was trying to do something. Bad application is an appropriation, a hijacking, which is quite a different thing, and it could be the playing of the game of the other one. In fact, Paul VI had that intuition as early as 1971, 1972, because there had been this hope. I remember actually I was in Rome in 1975, and there was still a freshness in the air, still in the English College, the Venerabile there. People talk in a hopeful mode about true aggiornamento. It was the explosion of the renewal. There were young people there, and one got the impression the first generation that are going to apply this renewal, and it was interesting. There was hope in the air. It was a positive thing that was felt in the immediate wake of the Second Vatican Council. And then, as time went on, actually Benedict XVI, he puts this in his autobiography, how he, of course, in the beginning was one of the periti and one of the experts in renewal and part of the liturgical movement, and he was aware of what had to be done. And in fact, the comment of one of the main engineers of the renewal there in the liturgical movement when the publication of the Sacrosanctum Concilium came in, no, actually afterwards, when the version of the Concilium's final draft of what was going to be what we have now, the Novus Ordo Mass, the comment was by this expert, virtually all the lights of the liturgical movement have been realized. We've achieved our goal. So that was the immediate reaction. We have a good version here. And if one looks carefully at the rubrics of the 1969 Missal, as the fathers wanted it and put it clearly down in the broad outlines given for renewal, it had to be seen that if any changes were made, it had to be done in such a way that it could be seen that the new came from the old. And that is actually, if we look carefully at the rubrics of 1969 Missal, that is what we actually have. And we in the monastery were taught, if we wanted to be anyway, both rites, and it was useful because the prior and the experts who were teaching us were indicating how there's an explanation for the vestigial part left in the new, in where we're coming from. So it's only then we're actually understood fully the new. Everything has a root, and it's part of this continuous linear movement and organic growth. And the problem is precisely that then now, we're 2 generations later, those who are being ordained have not been exposed to that. They're coming from only what they've known without this feeling of the weight of tradition behind them. So they've come in with a neo-Protestant mode of do-it-ourselves. The assembly is its own point of reference, which is an error. We can't do that because we have to guard the deposit as people would have it in the East. In fact, it's what the Apostle Paul mentioned to his son in the Lord, Timothy, whom he ordained bishop. Guard the deposit. The liturgy is higher than ourselves. And this mode of thinking we know better than the church and itching to fabricate, innovate each time is pathetic. So, just be aware that these things now that we're used to all around us were not even remotely envisaged by what the Spirit in fact was trying to say to the churches. To understand what had to be done, we need to see the illness that was there. And it was the fact that because of the notion of pensum, both in the breviary and in the Tridentine Mass, there was the problem of many, many words. It's actually extremely heavy, the Tridentine Mass, as is the old breviary. And the result is, because of the absence of concelebration, that one had half an hour from amice to amice, including all the prayers before and after. So, what's happening? Newman, who became a Catholic priest, comments in one of his writings, the way we do things, referring to the speed, because of course you have to adjust to that, because the Anglican mode is very much prosaic. But we, until the changes, all had the same quantity of words with no alternatives of formulae, and therefore, if one looks carefully at both the way the priest and the server were doing what they were doing on a daily basis, it was pretty fast, pretty fast. And so, in practice, that was an illness which contaminated our prayer on the level of the whole mystical body, because the breviary was the same, tendentially, there would be exceptions, but tendentially it was the same, and also it came into other parts as well, like the speed of the rosary, that speed was the norm. So what's going on then? The notion of actually engaging with the individual words, exceptionally, there were exceptions, of course, generally it was not actually there. It was automatic pilot. Now I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot of truth in it too. Just to be aware, there was therefore the Spirit trying to do something, to heal something, and wanting Spirit-filled prayer, worship in spirit and in truth. And the truth was precisely that the words actually mattered. So reducing hugely the number of words, and in their place introducing pauses. How many priests introduced the pauses? It might be better in Holland, I don't know. It probably is better in Holland. But in many places, no. I don't know how it is, I've not experienced it. Because you celebrate very well here. And
it's the
not the typical situation perhaps. But in Ireland, you see, if you have a talkative priest, he can't stop talking. Just words, words, words. So all the pauses are gone, and even they will fill in, for instance, the formula. There are different formulae for the penitential rite, but each one has a pause. And that's the first thing to go, is you can't stop talking. So on it goes, an unstoppable flow of words. It is a new version of the old, more of the same thing in different forms. Words, words, words. So let's get this straight. there was a bomb to be exploded well. And we still have to be aware of that, because if we're fully aware that we haven't got less but more in our hands, then we can do things calmly and well as the Spirit wanted us to do. Because I have many times made to myself this reflection, celebrating both in Italy and in Ireland and in my own hermitage, that actually on a daily basis, the well, that's the important, the well celebrated Novus Ordo Mass is actually more contemplative than the average of what would have been, if you like, the priest and server up there at high speed and the people saying the rosary in the pews. In other words, there was a need for renewal. Because now one engages fully with the people, they meet the Lord, they have a word of encouragement, they actually have an individual celebration each time, which is different each time because they've heard a homily, and they can have bits of singing which wasn't there before, because now the distinction between sung and said is gone. And so, in other words, a well celebrated, I insist, the well celebrated pleasant Mass is not to be lamented. And that's kind of important, because there's a lot of overreaction to it. People don't realise the problem is not there. The problem is somewhere else. It's on the problem of those massively, quite often, on a parish level or even higher up, who were mangling and hijacking what the Spirit was trying to say to the churches. It went the wrong way in many places, not everywhere. Fortunately, as we see here, and as I grew up in the monastic world, actually my own parish, one of my did the same thing, where there was prayer, where there was a weight of tradition, that didn't happen. We calmly, when I was a child, went from the old to the new, bit by bit. We kept all the ceremonial, about 6 small candles carried by little acolytes and 2 big ones, lots of incense, and so on for a long time after the Second Vatican Council, but still in Latin, but bits of English coming in, but fully sung in English this time. And then eventually we had once a month fully in Latin with the new rite, and other times fully in English sung, the High Mass, and the same ceremonial basically, except one difference went, it was that the deacon, if he was a second priest, would no longer be dressed as a deacon. That was happening still when I was a child, and then he would say either conciliary would not be there. So that was just into the invitation to be what you are. You're not supposed really to be behaving as a deacon if you're actually a presbyter. So all that to say, that was a calm dovetailing without a rupture. And then one sees there the continuity, because these precisely were people who had an interior life, and that's the essence of the problem. If that's not there, the rest will follow or not follow. So that's the important bit. Start there, and we're bound, as in human love, to express what we feel. If there's relationship there, we will express it. If that's not there, we won't. It's the problem at that level when people attack the wrong problem. So, because by the way, in parenthesis, if one examines certain groups who have rejected completely the renewal and have exclusively the old rite, sometimes one goes to their celebrations on a private level or whatever, private masses rather than big ones, and one sees the problem as it was. I'm not judging now, just observing a fact of life. And in some groups where they only have the old, one sees exactly the problem still there, and it's basically because they're not challenged. They're not challenged. I'm not making fun of it now, but there was a problem. We have to be aware of it. So it's not all brilliant before the changes and awful now, because there are very, very, very good celebrations done according to the Spirit of God now. In fact, the other day I was very moved, actually moved to tears. We buried a dear friend, and there it was an example of what can be done in the new rite. It was a priest friend of mine, I'll be supplying from tomorrow evening actually, a very holy young priest, very good man, and we were celebrating the funeral in his church because he was a parishioner, and I noticed there, because they were formed by him, and by a good predecessor before him, how things were done properly. You could hear a pin drop before, during and after. No one talked at all in church, the church was full. The celebration was purely vertical, lots of beautiful singing, and he was a good singer himself. Sermon was God word, not man word. And at a certain point, at Holy Communion, as we were celebrating, it was all done with great reverence, communion with great reverence, I almost heard something whisper during Holy Communion, "This is how I want it." And it was the nuance. In other words, the problem is not on the rite, it's on the person and the people applying it badly. So, with regard to this, it is interesting that it was the sacred liturgy which was attacked first in the council, indicating its centrality, as we find that in the present canon law, the volume, the central volume there on the sanctifying role of the Church is very spiritual. And also the concluding thrust is extremely spiritual. We are told that the whole order of the life of the Church and its law is the sanctification of souls, and it is in that ambit that things are to be interpreted. Now, the actual thrust of canon law can be actually summed up in one canon, 1752. And it is the concluding one of the whole canon block itself. The purpose of the Church's whole juridical and pastoral order consists of this salvation, as the last canon of the Code of Canon Law tells us. Pre oculis habita salute animarum, qui in ecclesia suprema semper lex esse debet, indicating that it's the salvation of souls that has to be kept before our eyes. The whole Church exists in function of that. Now, we forget that even though the Second Vatican Council was a pastoral council in thrust, it wasn't without dogmatic content, notably in Lumen Gentium, but also in other parts. There are things coming in which here are dogmatic in content, and clearly so, and they are sometimes brushed aside. Having said that, the liturgy is seen to be the very centre of its life. Liturgia est culmen ad quod actio ecclesiae tendit, et simul fons, unde omnis eius virtus emanat, or emanat. Now, the way in which the Church is asked to adjust things in such a way that all its life works towards the praise of God and flows from that in the specific liturgical mode is central. It had been thought that actually the one that would really cause problems in the Second Vatican Council would be the one on the role of bishops, and it was postponed, it would seem. They handled this one first. It thought that because the whole question, they had a job to define certain things with regard to this collegiality. That was the big one, because it involved doctrine in a big way. And there were a few drafts, I understand, which didn't pass. The liturgy actually did pass first before the others, and it was something which it passed because it was basically not going into detail. The details came later. The guidelines were given only, but they were spiritual guidelines. With regard to the aggiornamento, it was something that quickly became a buzzword. Now, Paul VI had to handle what he inherited. He was elected when the council was in full swing, remember, and things were already underway. In his speech given in 1965, on the occasion of the 8th public session of the Council, Paul VI criticized the behavior of those who incorrectly and abusively misinterpret the intention of Blessed Pope John XXIII on the Church's pastoral adaptation to the new needs of our time, aggiornamento. That, of course, is based on the word giorno, aggiornement. Furthermore, the Pope expounds the spirit of the Council in this regard and puts everyone on guard against doctrinal and juridical relativism, stating that Pope John the 23rd certainly did not want to attribute to this programmatic word the meaning that some are trying to give it, as if it were to agree to relativize everything in the Church, according to the spirit of the world today, dogmas, laws, structures, traditions, whereas the sense of the Church's doctrine and structural stability was so alive and firm in him as to make it the cornerstone of his thought and of his work. Now he goes on, aggiornamento will mean, from now forward, for us, wise penetration of the spirit of the Council, celebrated, and faithful application of its norms, issued in happy and holy wise. Now, in the original text, Paul VI does not use the word aggiornamento, but the word accommodatio. The famous expression aggiornamento of Blessed John the 23rd has become legendary by now. In his original intention, this expression has nothing to do with the doctrinal, legal, or liturgical relativism. So, the problem came from two sides. One internal and the other external. The Council was celebrated at a pivotal time in the history of mankind. It was a period of great change, and therefore, by the end of the Council, there was a social situation already evolved since its inception. I will quote in extenso this quite dramatic paragraph of Pope Paul VI, right at the conclusion of the Council. In the homily of Blessed Paul VI during the last General Congregation on December the 7th, 1965, we have the following description of the historical period in which the Second Vatican Council was celebrated. Now listen carefully, because it's kind of heavy stuff, but it's worth listening to, also because of its eloquence. It is necessary, says the Pope, to remember the time in which it was realized. A time which everyone admits is orientated towards the conquest of the kingdom of earth, rather than that of heaven. A time in which forgetfulness of God has become habitual and seems quite wrongly to be prompted by the progress of science. A time in which the fundamental act of the human person, more conscious now of himself and of his liberty, tends to pronounce in favor of his own absolute autonomy, in emancipation of every transcendent law. A time in which secularism seems the legitimate consequence of modern thought, and the highest wisdom in the temporal ordering of society. A time in which the soul of man has plumbed the depths of irrationality and desolation. A time, finally, which is characterized by upheavals and a hitherto unknown decline, even in the great world religions. It was at such a time as this that our council was held to the honor of God. That is a very penetrating paragraph, because we blame the council for what is not its fault. It came at a time when television came, when pop music came, when values were lost, massively at the same time throughout especially the Western world. That is not without importance with regard to how things then were going to be applied. Now, how does that affect us? It is, I would say, the experience of a lot of us that actually, if you scratch, the people have still the sense of the faithful, and they're not actually happy deep down about what they find in church. And the proof is that they're willing to travel if they find a place where there's peace, quiet, and especially verticality. I was listening to a good holy retired bishop one day. He was leading a holy hour in our cathedral, and he gave this testimony before the Blessed Sacrament. He was saying quite honestly that after retiring he'd found things as they actually were in parishes where he went to supply over a weekend here and there. It wasn't the grand pontificals of his bishop's days, it was reality. And one day he found in a church where he was celebrating one Sunday morning a lady coming up to Holy Communion whom he recognized. So afterwards he had a word with her. "My dear, what are you doing in this parish so far away from your home?" "Well, my lord, the truth is, I come all this way because I found here a priest